who should have Fighter of the Year? I think Fighter of the Year should go to Terence Crawford. For numerous of reasons, he should have it, but let me state a few. For number one, he was the underdog in that fight. He has always been the underdog when it came to Errol Spence. As far as the fight card goes, and as far now the resume, if fans of the sport were looking at his resume, then they would see that maybe he was not the underdog and that he was indeed the champion in that fight, the people's champ in that fight, just because he was the most prolific out of the two when it comes to their resume and their track record. But as far as the business goes, you got to remember Errol Spence, the truth. You know, he's with the biggest team in boxing. You know, and with that comes a bigger stage, a bigger presence, a bigger marketing team, a bigger marketing budget. And what that looks like is having the key to the biggest markets, you know, New York City, California, Dallas, Texas, New York City, California, Texas, Atlanta, Georgia. You know, the biggest markets, the cities, the New York City, the Los Angeles, Dallas, Texas, Houston, Texas, those markets where, you know, the population is so dense that when it comes to rallying troops, you know, to come out and buy tickets for a fight in the area, you're always going to sell out. And when you're the A side, and when you are when that area is going to be business wise biased towards the highest bidder, right, which would be, you know, Al Heyman, Mayweather, because they have the bigger companies, they have the bigger deals, right? Pretty much Terence Crawford put his name on the line, right? It was just his name right beside Al Heyman, Mayweather, and Errol Spence when it comes to the business side, right? So when it comes to the business side, when they're sitting across the table from each other, when they're sitting across the table from each other, you're looking at Terence Crawford and you're looking at Al Heyman and Mayweather. When they're sitting across the table from each other, you don't see Errol Spence. Errol Spence is the fighter in this situation. He's not the businessman. At the end of the day, he might get the last choice in the fight details, you know, as far as the purse size, as far as if he feels like he should really be fighting Terence Crawford at this time. But at the end of the day, when it all was said and done, Terence Crawford was not being seen to be the champion in that fight. And I believe solely because Errol Spence had the biggest marketing budget, he had the biggest stage, and his fans were biased toward him more so because they really couldn't break down the sport in the way it should be broken down to comprehend that Terence Crawford was the biggest dog in the fight. Not the biggest underdog, but the biggest dog, period, in the fight. So once he upset, you got to remember, Errol Spence has a lot of fans, right? Remember, he's coming from the biggest team. He's coming from the biggest team, right? The most biased reporters, you know, the most biased critics. Even though they're critics, they're always gonna be he's always gonna have they're always gonna be in his favor because, you know, business. They may be, on the payroll type thing. But yeah, so that was, to me, that was the biggest upset of the year. That was the biggest upset of the year for a lot of fans. If we're talking fans, remember, pay-per-view numbers speaks numbers, right? Errol Spence has bigger pay-per-view numbers than Tank Davis. He's doing consistently 300,000 plus pay-per-view buys. Tank Davis is doing consistently 200,000 pay-per-view buys. 200,000 plus pay-per-view buys, excuse me. But yeah, so then you see who the king of pay-per-view buys is in this era. It's Errol Spence. So when they fight, they have what? I think they did 700 pay-per-view buys. Now I would say that was more solid. Like the 700 pay-per-view buys in the Errol Spence and Terence Crawford fight was a more solid number than the Tank Davis and the Ryan Garcia fight, because the Tank Davis and Ryan Garcia fight was more built off hype. The Terence Crawford and Errol Spence fight was more built. Keep in mind, I do believe, I got to go back and check. It has been a while since I looked at it, but I do believe Terence Crawford was the B side. So Errol Spence was the A side. So basically, he was the people's champ, not people's champ, but he was favored to win. He was the A side. I wouldn't say he was favored to win, but because he was A side, but he had the better deal in the fight. But going back to the pay-per-view buys, that 700,000 pay-per-view buys speaks numbers when it comes to that Ryan Garcia and Tank Davis fight. That 700,000 is a more solid number. Those are real people who really understand that these two fighters are going to make history with this fight. Nobody really is thinking that Ryan Garcia and Tank Davis, they're gonna make history with their fight. That's more hype. That's more social media driven. This is the Terence Crawford and Errol Spence fight is more boxing world driven, more sports world driven, more entertainment world driven. It's solid, right? So with that being said, because other than Terence Crawford, Errol Spence, Tank Davis, other than those three, nobody has been doing the type of work that begs for. Go ahead, you good. Going this way? All right. Nobody yeah, but nobody I don't think anybody deserves the stage more than those three fighters: Errol Spence, Terence Crawford, and Tank Davis, because they've really been putting in work. They've really been bringing people out to see big fights. So when it comes to fighter of the year, I think the most prolific fighter out of those three, speaking to their resume, their track record, their IQ, their skill set, their confidence level, their ability to market themselves, when it's all said and done, out of those three, Terence Crawford has done the most. And not only has he done the most, he's proved the most people wrong. Think about that. And not only has he proved the most people wrong, but he was his own hype man. Think about that. And not only was he his own hype man, but he went out and got his justice on Top Rank. At the top of his game, he went out and got his justice from Top Rank, because he knew he was the best, but he felt like he was being treated unfairly. So he took it to the legal system and he won. Think about that. So when you put all of these things together, litigation, having to go to court, having to file court documents, having to do these things, when you put these things together, plus having to be in the gym to train, when you put these things together, plus having to run your businesses, plus having to take care of your family, plus having to market yourself, you're not standing under the biggest brand. You're not a PBC fighter. You're not a Mayweather Promotions fighter, and you're not with Bob Arum anymore. You're not Top Rank anymore, right? So he's super independent. And through all of this, he's still able to come out and get a dominating win against Errol Spence. I mean, a huge upset, right? So I do believe Terence Crawford should be fighter of the year, if not fighter of the decade, just for all of that.